Hey, hello everybody, and welcome to Contemporary Art and Open Learning with Neil Mulholland. I am Lou Mycroft. I'm here to chair the session. And you know what, Neil, that title only hints at the glories within. So I'm really excited about this. I got to see the abstract and I was excited then too. But Neil is Professor Neil Mulholland, Chair of Contemporary Art Practice and Theory at the School of Art at Edinburgh University, which is a place close to my heart as well. So I'm delighted to welcome you here today, Neil. And what Neil's going to talk about is actually an ongoing art project, about 10 years or more, which has come together in an actual course this year. So I'm really interested in that shift that you made, and the work that is behind all of this. The art practice is Shift Work is the title of it, if you want to look that up. And Neil works in collaboration with artists Dan Brown, Jake Watts and Naomi Garrick. So just name checking them. I don't know if anybody's watching, Neil, but listen, let me hand over to you because I'm really excited for you to make a start.
Cool. Okay, thanks a lot. So I'm going to read through this and share a single slide with you that you can follow up later. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about the background to this. So intentional art education today takes diverse organisational forms. It traverses small artist initiatives, international biennials, and art academies, and of course artistic practices themselves. Artistic learning is porous and it's ubiquitous. And crucially, it is life-wide, so it's discovered through a wide variety of formal and informal arts contexts. Artistic learning is a distinctly live and embodied life-wide experience, and this emphasis on event has enabled the pandemic to bring contemporary art to a virtual standstill. Here in Scotland, revenue, for example, has more than halved, and more than 50% of art workers have lost their jobs. So the damage to contemporary arts during the pandemic, I think, has been magnified due to the fact that formal art education's over-reliance on the studio has been its primary means of socialization. And until the pandemic pivot a year ago, there had been relatively few virtual communities of artistic learners. So how might contemporary artistic learning be reimagined in light of the open paradigm, paragogy and para-academia? How could open and para approaches help to catalyse the art world's recovery? So to partly address these issues, I'm going to reflect on this new course that I taught in collaboration with my colleagues in the Art and Learning Research Group, Jake Watts, Emma Balkind and Beth Danowski. The course, Contemporary Art and Open Learning, was designed to enable colleagues and art students to open access to artistic learning by peer producing, codifying and sharing their own learning practices. Although the course was composed back in 2018, by the time it ran in September 2020, Scotland was in lockdown. This presented a welcome opportunity to refashion the course as a digital OER. Using a Kanban, we created an agile process for curriculum design, and our OER was rapidly swarmed on Notion and made available via our WordPress for playtesting. Our OER enables anyone to practice a range of peer-based learning theories by practicing the paragogics pioneered in 2011 by the mathematician Joe Corneli. Paragogy's focus on making tacit knowledge explicit makes it particularly conducive to teaching art. Now, the OER is split into two components, the first being Play to Learn, which focuses on do it together and peer-to-peer. And the second, the Art and Learning Fair, which is really about composing and reflecting and reproducing. Now, I'm going to start with Play to Learn. Paragogics is leaderless and has no distinct roles, so everyone is a learner or a paragog. Because of this, staff had to join one of four distinct groups of formal learners. Each group began by establishing their covenant using a Nishida-inspired method called Build-a-Basho, wherein they define and limit the parameters of their unique paragogics. In the absence of a studio, this covenant became the playing and making environment. Having self-socialized as learners, Each group then engaged with foundational concepts such as do it together, peer-to-peer, life-wide learning, the open paradigm, and crucially, the educational turn in contemporary art practice. These groups learned playfully by collectively completing weekly art assignments that we hosted on our WordPress. So, for example, one assignment involved hacking counseling methods to arrive at an insight-oriented form of coaching, which centered on alterity rather than self-awareness. And this provided insight into what we already know and into how we can support each other's learning. Completing the circle of this Ouroboros crit enabled each group to become a peer-to-peer learning exchange. Art assignments then were metacognitive. Participating in them helped groups to devise, test, and run their own art assignments. Paragogs play tested. We experienced what worked in disparate learning environments and gained a sense into how our diverse life experiences led us to respond differently to stimuli. So the educational rationale for each of the assignments was supported by the OER, which relayed open learning resources that scaffolded this peer-to-peer learning. These open resources were only engaged following completion of each of the art assignments. Group peer review of the resources was swarmed as a form of open marginalia. So we used open web annotation and Notion to capture this asynchronously before we met for our weekly stand-ups. So crucially, Paragogs acted first, and then they critically reflected on action as collective inquiry, thinking through the different lenses hosted by the OER. So the second part of this course structure was always intended to support Paragogs to run their own workshops as part of a not-for-profit art and open learning fair, which would be hosted in a public space in Edinburgh. We adapted this brief so that Paragogs would generate an OER that would facilitate or prompt an artistic workshop. This way, we were able to fork our staff-devised OER resources into 4 new peer-run OERs. Thus, the co-learning of Paragogs would snowball into a public resource that can be exponentially repurposed. The common point of inquiry all groups chose to work with here was the Fluxist artist Joseph Beuys's 1978 provocation, Jeder Mensch ein Künstler, or Can Anyone Be an Artist, as we repurposed it. Rooted in Beuys's Edinburgh Poorhouse Action Objects from 1974, his Free International University, and his work with the prisoner Jimmy Boyle in Scotland, this provocation seemed prescient of the emancipatory potential of open creation, paragogy, and the do-it-together art schools movement of the 21st century. Acting as collectivized researchers, 4 groups composed different workshops that modified Beuys's provocation. Using a Kanban to visualize workflow and limit work in progress, each group aspired to honor David Cowell's open education design principles of design for access, agency, participation, and experience. The groups took it in turns to play test each other's workshops and then give constructive feedback and support informed by Cowell's principles. So catalyzing the art world's recovery, I think, will require engaging a broader constituency of participants. Following the philosopher Paul Boschiers, I want to consider now how artists can foster the creation of open research objects that will create new publics that result from the circulation of these objects. Like studio-based learning, OERs produce subjectivity. They socialize learners and generate different publics. So rather than fixate on questions of content and purpose, my own reflective analysis here has focused on relationships. The main participants in the Open Art Fair were the course staff and students and international members of the Shift Work Network. While this was a large pool, each workshop was relatively small, limited to just 40 participants. Nevertheless, our OER is a truly open curricula, and it allows for full freedom of modification. And in this sense, I would say artistic OERs are akin to Joseph Beuys's action object. That is, they are catalysts for holistic relational learning. So while the Edinburgh course was running, my colleague Beth Danowski versioned it with her HNC Contemporary Art Practice students over in Glasgow Clyde College. The artist Debjani Banerjee had been remixing the OER simultaneously when teaching local primary 5 children at Edinburgh Sculpture Workshop, which is, I should say, is the project's non-academic partner. Another mod of the OER is currently being hosted by the Canadian curator Nevin Lochhead and his Dark Matter Playgroup, an artist collective who run a gallery in Kingston, Ontario. The Canadian mod, which focuses on informal learning, is called Fabricating Vibe. The OER's Creative Commons license encourages such mods and derived works to be distributed under the same terms as the original. Every time the OER is versioned, it grows branches, hybridized workshops in the form of more OERs, which in turn are versioned. Such looping reverberation has quickly grown an evolving repository of open workshop distributions. Now, I see this as a fermentation process, and my role here then is to germinate the most lively cultures in my own future course iterations. The VLE thus becomes a host for what I would call a scoop, a symbiotic colony of OERs and people. This way, quality enhancement is psychobiotic. So as far as I know then, to date, the OER is being adapted by educators, informal, formal, and life-wide learners in both art organisations and educational institutions. Adopters and modders are close-knit communities of interest, but they form part of a bigger network, and this harbours potential for such artistic learning to become collective artistic research, something closer to Deleuze's new image of thought than to open textbook publishing. Ethical relationships that are established through communities of interest are frequently the bedrock of self-identifying cohorts of artistic peer learners. Interpersonal care and a sense of trust can slowly build a basho, that is, support for a shared community of practice. So in do it together initiatives, nurturing social relationships very often precedes and even counters any desire to codify such relationships through organizing or collectivizing for such purposes. The OER's support for informal learning, I think, fits perfectly with art's post-rationalist ethics of care. The way, that is, in which artistic knowledge creation as a relational practice is continuously modified through doing it together. So as action objects, artistic OERs offer a great opportunity to create new publics for contemporary art by commoning, making, and being. The OER emphasis on action-based, authentic, life-wide, and performative learning makes it particularly conducive to scaffolding the acquisition of artistic practice. Thus, while currently rewriting our BFA art programme in Edinburgh, we have sought to actively embody open educational principles throughout the new curriculum. Now, thanks to lockdown, we're not alone in this. For example, this spring, I'm enrolled in Luca's Blend and Bleed programme, which is a series of online workshops on performance, pervasive play, and trans reality. And so far, I've taken part in workshops on art LARPing, hive mind training, and conspiracy theory composition. The practice here again comes first, and reflection on action is later supported by a Discord-based critique on bleed, fabulation, game theory, and play theory. It's taking part in these kind of artistic workshops, it makes it evident just how easily they can be repurposed for non-artistic fields. For example, our own workshop, Make Gold, functions brilliantly as a heuristic tool for co-investigating any value chain. Another, the Ouroboros crit, is a very effective life-wide learning exchange technique, and composing conspiracy theories is a brilliant way in which to understand evidence-based research. So herein, artistic research methods become interoperable methods of learning by doing, offering themselves up to other fields of collective inquiry. In conclusion then, I'd say that embracing the open paradigm's vision of education as a human right could better equip formal art educational organisations to fulfil UNESCO's right to participate in cultural life. However, we must remember that cultural life is fermented formally and informally. Working together, OERs and people can catalyze the recovery for forming symbiotic colonies of artistic learning and thus build new art worlds. Okay, that's me.
That was, I feel like my head is bulging, but I've sort of taken off in all sorts of different directions. My own practice is very rhizomatic, so there were loads of, new concepts, but a lot of sort of relatable stuff in there for me, which was absolutely brilliant. I'm waiting for the audience to kick in. We've got 5 minutes for questions, but I want to pick out a couple of things that just really resonated for me, Neil. That idea of ethical relationships, the whole sort of holistic practice. And I was particularly interested in, you said, interoperable methods of learning. Until my research is all about not making the invisible visible, but making those visible boundaries invisible, if that makes sense, so that we can actually see, the undercommons of what's there. I'm really and so I love that idea. You talked about symbiotic OER cultures and that art is continually modified by doing it together. It's a real community approach, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's really that is the basis of the project. So the pandemic has come along. It's kind of been opportune, but what we were really trying to build was an analog OER. So it takes, it functions in a physical space, and usually we'd use a studio, or we would, we'd visit different galleries and work in their studios. But it's I think it's the symbiosis is crucially important as a sort of challenge to how art education is normally practiced. It's usually very individualistic, and it's all about nurturing individuals and their development. So it's quite closed rather than socialized in this way.
Yeah, no, brilliant. Neil is asking, how did the students react to this change from the studio to online? I mean, this was happening in a really sort of frightening and dislocating time, of course.
Well, I mean, we were going to not use the studio. I mean, that was a key idea of this course, was it would not be based in a studio, but rather we would make use of other learning spaces. So we would initially engage with the Edinburgh Sculpture Workshop. They have a court, an open outdoor space where they make or fabricate stone-based works and metal work that you can't do inside. And the Edinburgh Sculpture Workshop's got a really active public education program as well, so they're engaged with all sorts of different communities in and beyond Edinburgh. So the whole point of the course was to open out physically and get out of our art school building, not be located there at all. So it going online was actually in some ways really helpful. I mean, the other thing, of course, which was unusual, I think, is like half the students were in China when we started it. They couldn't get here. So we had to make use of the cities that they were in, as well as where we were. If we were in if we were in Scotland, we were not all in Edinburgh, different bits of Scotland. So everyone was in a different environment because of lockdown. But the students in China were kind of freer to go out and use their local amenities and environments and so on. So that helped explode the geography of what would otherwise have been, a kind of more limited terrain, I think we would have used had it been offline.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah. Christina Rance is asking, any other advantages? Anything, I mean, I'm adding to that really by saying anything that surprised you?
The other advantages, I think, was, we did a lot of like translation work, partly again because of this sort of Chinese European split in terms of the time that we were working through, and so we also had to use a mix of synchronous and asynchronous to handle the different time zones as well. But I think the key advantage was that the students really kind of took to using a lot of the open annotation techniques, and swarming became really important. So each group really swarmed everything that they did. They would either split things up and say, well, we'll read this book together. It has 12 chapters. We'll take on 2 each and then report back. Or they would, they would divide quite naturally sort of divide up their labour if they decided they had to work on something. And all those digital swarming tools were really brilliant for that. And we managed to stick to using ones that were open rather than what the university would have provided us with. So I think learning to use open tools and see how you can get access to some of those tools for free and be, quite thrifty, I think was quite important. I found that was an advantage, that rather than the students feeling that they had to gain access to expensive workshop equipment and studio space in order to be creative.
Yeah, I totally love that. And well done for being able to, get beyond the university prescribed stuff, because my background is further education in England. That's quite hard for people to be allowed to use this beyond Microsoft Teams or whatever. So I love hearing that. Listen, we've run out of time, which I can't.
Sorry.
There's a fabulous question from Max Mahmood Wardeh, which I think would run a little bit. So perhaps Max could ask that over on
the Discord.
On the Discord, yeah. But Neil, that's been fantastic. I wish we'd had 2 hours. Thanks so much for sharing that.
All right, cheers, Lou. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, bye.
See you later.
Nom nom nom.